In 2013, four black high school basketball players vanished during a late-night drive home from an away game in a remote mountain town. 10 years later, hikers discover a blocked cave near the old highway, with varsity jackets and muddy sneakers half buried in the dirt at the entrance. The fabric of the jackets, once bright school colors, was now faded and stiff with caked earth. One sneaker lay on its side, laces undone, as if kicked off in a hurry. The hikers, a young couple out for an autumn afternoon, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They knew, everyone in the sparsely populated county knew, about the boys who never made it home. They exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. This was it. This was where the silence of a decade might finally break. They backed away slowly, careful not to disturb anything further, their eyes fixed on the dark opening of the cave, a space mostly sealed by a rock slide that looked almost deliberately placed. One of them pulled out a phone, fingers fumbling with the screen, the signal weak and intermittent in the rugged terrain. "We need to call someone," one whispered, the words barely audible above the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. "Who do you even call for ghosts?" The news, when it finally reached the sheriff's office in the small town of Oakhaven, the closest settlement to that stretch of forgotten highway, landed like a physical blow. Sheriff Brody, a man who'd been a deputy back in 2013, felt the years collapse. He'd known the boys. Not well, but he'd seen them play, seen their faces in the missing posters that had papered every telephone pole and storefront for years. Those posters were long gone now, weathered away or taken down, but the faces remained etched in the town's collective memory. He drove out to the site himself, the old highway barely more than a gravel track, overgrown and forgotten since the new interstate bypassed it years ago. The hikers were waiting, pale and subdued, pointing towards the cave entrance. Brody saw the jackets, the sneakers. His breath caught. It felt like walking into a memory, a cold, hard place he thought he'd sealed off. He recognized the faded emblem on one jacket sleeve, the Oakhaven Eagles. There was no denying it. The silence was indeed about to break, and he wasn't sure what terrors it would unleash. For 10 years, the families had lived in a limbo of unknowing. Now, they were about to be thrust back into the sharpest point of their grief, but this time with a horrifying new focus. The call to Sarah Jenkins, mother of Marcus, the team captain, was the hardest Brody ever had to make. He remembered her from 10 years ago, a pillar of strength then, organizing searches, pleading with the media, refusing to let her son's name fade. But the years had taken their toll. When he told her, there was a long, terrible silence on the other end of the line. Then, a sound like a dam breaking, a decade of held-back tears, hope and horror, twisted together. The other families reacted similarly. Elation that something, anything, had been found. Crushing fear of what that something might mean. They had prayed for answers, but now that an answer seemed close, the reality of it was almost too much to bear. What could possibly be inside that cave after all this time? And why was it blocked? That question hung heavy in the air. Was it a natural rockfall? Or had someone sealed it, trapping something? Or someone inside? The thought sent a fresh wave of dread through everyone who heard it. Engineers and a forensics team were called in from the state capitol. The local Oakhaven department was too small, too under-equipped for something like this. The cave entrance was precarious. The rocks that blocked it were large, deeply embedded, and looked like they could shift further at any moment. It wasn't just a matter of pulling them away. They had to be careful. Evidence, if any remained, was paramount. And safety. No one wanted another tragedy. News crews started to arrive, kept at a distance by a quickly established police line, their cameras like hungry vultures. The families gathered too, a small, somber group, watching from afar, their faces etched with a mixture of grief, anxiety, and a fragile, flickering hope. Every movement at the cave mouth, every shouted instruction from the engineers, made them jump. Each passing hour felt like an eternity. They had waited 10 years. What were a few more days? But these days, these hours, were different. They were filled with the suffocating possibility of an ending they might not be ready for. The jackets and sneakers were carefully bagged, tagged, and sent for analysis. Were they really the boys? After so long, could they even tell? The mud on the sneakers, the condition of the fabric, every detail would be scrutinized. But the real answers, everyone knew, lay beyond that wall of rock and earth. What secrets did that mountain hold? And had it held them for a decade, waiting? The first night fell on the active scene, floodlights bathing the area in a harsh, unnatural glow. The mountain loomed, dark and silent, watching. The initial assessment from the engineers was grim. The blockage was significant, a jumble of boulders and compacted soil. It would take specialized equipment and time to clear it safely. Days, they said, maybe longer. Each word was a blow to the waiting families. More waiting, more uncertainty. Sarah Jenkins clutched a worn photograph of Marcus, his smile wide, his eyes bright with the future he never got to see. Beside her, David's father, Mr. Henderson, a quiet man who had aged 20 years in the last 10, stared blankly at the illuminated cave entrance. He hadn't spoken much since his son disappeared. What was there to say? His wife had passed away 3 years prior. Her heart, he always said, broken by the not knowing. Now he stood there, alone with his grief, on the precipice of an answer that might break him too. The other two families, the Washingtons and the Carters, huddled together, finding solace in shared sorrow. They had become a different kind of family over the past decade, bound by a tragedy that no one else could truly understand. The discovery of the cave, the clothes, it was a shockwave. It ripped open old wounds, made them fresh and raw again. The varsity jackets, symbols of pride and achievement, now lay like accusations at the mouth of that dark hole. The sneakers, caked in mud. What story did that mud tell? A frantic escape? A struggle? Or something else entirely? The questions multiplied, breeding in the cold night air, unanswered. The air was thick with them, with unspoken fears. The remote location, the blocked entrance, it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like something hidden, something deliberate. And that was the most terrifying thought of all. The forensics team began sifting through the dirt around the cave entrance, even before it was fully cleared. Tiny fragments, anything that might offer a clue. Every shovelful of earth was treated like sacred ground. Was this where their journey ended, or where the truth began? The national media picked up the story, and suddenly, Oakhaven, a town most people couldn't find on a map, was at the center of a tragic mystery revived. Calls came in, old sightings, theories, psychic premonitions. Brody assigned a deputy to log them all, but his focus was on the cave. That's where the answers were, if there were any left. He thought back to the original investigation. The boys, Marcus, David, Jamal, and Kevin, had left the away game in high spirits, despite their loss. They were driving Marcus's old sedan, a car that was later found abandoned on a different, less remote stretch of Old Highway 7, miles from this cave. The car had been out of gas. Their wallets and phones were gone. There were no signs of a struggle. It was as if they had simply walked away from it. But to where? And why? Searches at the time had found nothing. Canine units had lost their scent a few hundred yards from the car. near a dense patch of woods. The theory then was that they'd tried to take a shortcut, got lost, or met with foul play. But no bodies were ever found. No ransom notes, just silence. Now, this cave, miles away from where the car was found. How did that fit? It didn't. Not yet. The discovery of the items here, so far from the car, opened up a whole new set of terrifying possibilities. It suggested they hadn't just wandered off. It suggested they had been taken to this remote place. Or fled here. But from what? The first layer of rocks was moved by the second day. The ground beneath was damp, disturbed. It wasn't a recent rockfall. The engineers confirmed it. This had happened a long time ago, perhaps even 10 years ago. The air grew heavier. The waiting became almost unbearable. What horrors lay sealed within? What story was that mountain finally ready to tell? By the third day, a small opening had been created, just large enough for a specialized camera to be inserted. The families watched on a monitor set up in a temporary command tent, their hands gripping each other, breaths held. The image flickered, then stabilized. Darkness, then shapes. Indistinct at first. The camera operator, a stoic man from the State Forensics Unit, maneuvered it slowly. He said nothing. The only sound was the whir of the camera's motor and the ragged breathing of the families. Then, a collective gasp. Something was there. Something man-made. Not just rocks and dirt. It was a backpack. A school backpack lying on its side, partially buried, much like the items outside. Its color was impossible to tell in the monochrome camera feed, but its shape was unmistakable. Next to it, another. And then, something else. Something that made Sarah Jenkins cry out. A raw, wounded sound. It looked like a bone. The camera operator quickly panned away, but the image was seared into their minds. A bone. The word echoed in the sudden crushing silence of the tent. Was it animal? Or was it them? The operator, under instruction from the lead forensic anthropologist who had just arrived, focused the camera back, more slowly this time. The anthropologist, Dr. Aris Thorne, a woman known for her calm demeanor in the face of the grim, spoke quietly to the operator. A little to the left. Hold it there. The image sharpened. Yes, it was a bone. Long, slender, and another, partially visible. Dr. Thorne made a quiet note on a pad. She didn't offer any immediate conclusions to the families. She couldn't. Not yet. But the hope that had flickered so tentatively in their hearts began to dim, replaced by a cold, encroaching dread. The cave was not empty. And it was not a haven. It was starting to look like a tomb. The work to clear the entrance redoubled in urgency, yet with even greater care. If there were remains, they needed to be preserved, handled with the utmost respect and scientific rigor. The mood among the workers became more somber. The initial excitement of a potential breakthrough was replaced by the grim reality of what they were likely to find. Sheriff Brody felt a weight settle on his shoulders, heavier than any he had carried before. He had to prepare the families, but how do you prepare someone for this? He remembered the boys' laughter, their cocky, teenage confidence. To think of them ending up in a place like this, it was unthinkable. Yet the evidence was pointing in a terrible direction. The location of the cave, so far off any known path, and so far from where their car was found, screamed of foul play. The blocked entrance only amplified that suspicion. Who would go to such lengths? And why? Were these boys, full of life and promise, victims of something random and brutal? Or was there something more sinister, something connected to that remote mountain town they had just visited? The town, Northwood, had always been insular, wary of outsiders. Its reputation was complicated. Stories circulated, whispers of old grudges, of a place that kept its secrets buried deep. Back in 2013, investigators had looked into Northwood. They'd interviewed locals, the opposing team, anyone who might have seen the boys after the game. But they'd hit a wall of silence, of polite but firm deflections. Nothing concrete had ever emerged. Now, with the discovery at the cave, those old uneasy feelings about Northwood resurfaced. Was it possible the answers lay not just in the cave, but back in that town, a town that seemed to prefer being forgotten? The discovery of the backpacks and the possible bones inside the cave shifted the investigation into a new, darker phase. This was no longer just a missing persons case. It was now, almost certainly, a homicide investigation. The question was, a homicide of how many, and by whom? The state investigators took the lead, with Sheriff Brody and his small department providing local support. Dr. Thorne, the forensic anthropologist, would be the one to enter the cave first, once it was deemed safe. Her job would be to map the scene, to understand the arrangement of whatever was inside, before anything was disturbed. It was a painstaking process, slow and methodical. For the families, it was agonizing. They were so close to answers, yet still so far. Sarah Jenkins found herself staring at the mountain, this silent, brooding behemoth that had held her son captive for a decade. She felt a rage building inside her, a rage against the mountain, against the people who did this, against the 10 lost years of not knowing. But beneath the rage, there was also a profound, aching sorrow. Marcus, her bright, funny, talented Marcus. What had his last moments been like? Had he been scared? Had he suffered? These were the questions that haunted her sleep, that would likely haunt her for the rest of her days, regardless of what they found in that cave. David Henderson's father simply sat, his shoulders slumped, his eyes fixed on the ground. He had no more tears to cry, no more words to speak. He was a hollow shell, waiting for the final, terrible confirmation. As the sun began to set on the 4th day, the engineers announced that a stable, narrow passage into the main chamber of the cave had been cleared. It was time. Dr. Thorne, dressed in full protective gear, prepared to enter. A hush fell over the entire area. The whir of generators, the distant murmur of the news crews, even the rustling of leaves seemed to fade away. All eyes were on the dark opening. Dr. Thorne carried a powerful light and a camera. She would document everything. She squeezed through the opening, disappearing into the blackness. The families watched the live feed on the monitor, their hearts pounding. The camera showed a narrow passage, then a larger space opening up. The floor was uneven, littered with rocks and debris. Dr. Thorne's light scanned slowly, and then it found them. Not just bones, skeletons, 4 of them, lying in a scattered, unnatural way, as if they had fallen or been thrown. The backpacks were there, yes, and articles of clothing, tangled with the remains, preserved to some extent by the cool, dry air of the cave. There was no doubt. It was them, the 4 missing basketball players. Sarah Jenkins let out a sob that seemed to tear from her very soul. Mr. Henderson closed his eyes, his face a mask of unimaginable pain. The Washingtons and the Carters clung to each other, weeping openly. 10 years of hoping against hope, of clinging to the slimmest chance that their boys might still be alive somewhere, all of it crashed down in that moment. The truth was here, in this cold, dark cave. It was brutal. It was final. Dr. Thorne's voice, calm and professional, came over the speaker, narrating her findings for the record, but her words were a distant buzz to the families. They saw only their sons, lost, and now found in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. The silence in the tent was broken only by the sounds of their grief, the mountain had given up its secret. And it was a nightmare. Dr. Thorne and her team worked for hours inside the cave, meticulously documenting, mapping, and beginning the delicate process of recovering the remains. Each bone, each fragment of clothing, each item found was treated with reverence. These were not just pieces of evidence. They were the last vestiges of 4 young lives cut tragically short. The varsity jackets, the ones found outside, were confirmed to match the school's design from that year. The sneakers, too. But inside, with the remains, other items began to surface. A silver chain with a small basketball charm. Marcus always wore that. A worn leather wallet, empty now, but its shape familiar to Mr. Henderson. It had been David's. A digital watch, its screen dark, its hands frozen at a time that meant nothing and everything. Jamal's mother recognized it instantly. And a small folded piece of paper tucked into what was once a jeans pocket, now little more than fibers. It was so fragile, so delicate. Dr. Thorne carefully placed it in a special evidence container. What could it be? A note? A name? A last message? The possibility sent a shiver through Sheriff Brody, who was observing the process. This piece of paper, if anything could be recovered from it, might be the key. Or it might be nothing. Just another piece of heartbreaking debris. The recovery would take days. The identification, though visually almost certain, would need to be confirmed by dental records and DNA. But no one in that tent, no one at that scene, had any doubt. The boys were home, in a way. But this was not the homecoming anyone had ever prayed for. The news of the discovery of 4 sets of human remains inside the cave spread quickly, beyond the police lines, beyond Oakhaven, across the state and the nation. The names of Marcus Jenkins, David Henderson, Jamal Washington, and Kevin Carter were once again on everyone's lips, not as missing boys, but as victims. The question now loomed larger than ever. What happened to them? How did they end up in that cave, miles from their car, their bodies left to the darkness? And who was responsible? The nature of the scene in the cave suggested they had not died there from exposure or an accident. The way the remains were found, scattered, some with signs of trauma, that Dr. Thorne noted in her preliminary assessment, though she wouldn't confirm details until a full autopsy, pointed towards a violent end. Someone had brought them here, or chased them here. And then, the cave was sealed. That was the detail that screamed premeditation. This wasn't a random act of violence in the woods. This was something else, something calculated. As the first of the remains, carefully shrouded, were brought out of the cave, a profound silence fell over the onlookers. The family stood, supported by friends and counselors who had arrived, watching the solemn procession. This was the reality. This was the end of their long, agonizing wait. There was a strange sense of peace for some, the terrible peace of certainty. The not knowing had been a special kind of torture. Now, at least, they knew. But that knowledge opened up a new chapter of pain. The quest for justice. Who did this to their sons? And why? Sheriff Brody felt the weight of that question settle firmly on his shoulders. The state investigators might have the lead, but this was his county, his town. These were his boys, in a way. He wouldn't rest until he found out who was responsible. He thought again of Northwood, the town they had visited for the game, the town that had been so uncooperative 10 years ago. Was it time to pay Northwood another visit? With the discovery of the bodies, with the certainty that this was a homicide, perhaps some of those closed mouths might be willing to open. Perhaps the fear of harboring such a dark secret for a decade might finally outweigh the fear of speaking out. Or perhaps not. Places like Northwood had long memories and a strong code of silence. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but now they had something they didn't have before. A crime scene. a tomb. And inside that tomb, perhaps, the final clues. The small, folded piece of paper found in Kevin Carter's pocket became a focal point of intense interest. It was sent to the state crime lab under guard, rushed for analysis. Could a 10-year-old piece of paper, buried in a cave, still hold a message? It seemed unlikely. But in a case this cold, this tragic, you clung to every sliver of possibility. The world watched, waited, the families mourned, and in the silence of the lab, a technician carefully began the process of trying to unfold a ghost's last words. What secrets would it reveal, if any? And would it be enough to break a decade of silence, a decade of stone-cold mystery? The air was thick with the unspoken. The mountain had yielded its dead. Now, it was time for the living to speak. The preliminary forensic report from Dr. Thorne came in a week later, and it confirmed the family's worst fears and Sheriff Brody's suspicions. The boys hadn't died of exposure or starvation. There were clear signs of trauma. Not all of them had the same injuries, but the patterns suggested a brutal, violent encounter. Some had injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. One, it appeared, may have suffered a gunshot wound, though the bullet was not immediately recovered at the scene. This changed everything. This wasn't just a case of boys getting lost and meeting a tragic end. This was murder, cold-blooded and calculated. The blocked cave entrance now seemed even more sinister. It wasn't just to hide the bodies, it was to ensure they were never found, to entomb them forever. Who possessed such cruelty? And what could have provoked such a savage attack on 4 high school athletes? The detail about the possible gunshot wound sent a chill through Brody. Guns weren't common in petty crimes in this region. A gun suggested something more serious, more organized, or more desperate. The old theories about a chance encounter with a lone madman in the woods began to fade. This felt bigger, darker. The small piece of paper from Kevin Carter's pocket, however, proved to be a frustrating dead end, at least initially. It was badly degraded, the fibers fragile. The lab technicians worked miracles to preserve it, to carefully unfold it, but the ink, if there ever had been much, was mostly gone, leached away by moisture and time. Under specialized lights, faint indentations could be seen, as if someone had written something with heavy pressure, but the words themselves were illegible. It was a ghostly imprint, a whisper of a message that couldn't quite be heard. Another hope dashed. Sarah Jenkins, when she heard, felt a familiar wave of despair. Each clue that fizzled out was like losing Marcus all over again, but she wouldn't give up. None of them would. Now that they knew their boys were victims of murder, their resolve for justice only hardened. They started a foundation, Justice for the Oak Haven Four, determined to keep the case in the public eye, to pressure the authorities, to ensure their sons were not forgotten again. Their faces, young and full of promise, were back on the news, back in newspapers, but this time, the word missing was replaced by murdered. The shift was brutal, but it was also a call to action. Sheriff Brody decided it was time to revisit Northwood. He drove there himself, unannounced, leaving his deputy in charge of Oak Haven. Northwood hadn't changed much in 10 years. It was still a small, insular town, nestled deep in the mountains, a place that felt a generation behind the rest of the world. The main street was quiet, storefronts looking a little more faded, a little more tired. He went to the local diner, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stood out. He ordered coffee, let the silence settle. He knew his presence wouldn't go unnoticed. He was the sheriff from Oak Haven, the town whose boys had been found dead after visiting Northwood. He didn't have to say anything. His uniform, his badge, They spoke for him. He was looking for answers. An old man at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, finally looked his way. His eyes were wary. "Heard they found those boys," the man said, his voice raspy. Brody nodded. "We did. Terrible thing," the man said, shaking his head. "Terrible." But there was no offer of information, no hint of shared sorrow. Just a statement of fact, a deflection. Brody knew this dance. He'd seen it 10 years ago, but this time he had the weight of 4 bodies, 4 murders behind him. He looked directly at the man. "They were murdered," Brody said, his voice quiet but firm. "After they left your town." The man looked down at his coffee cup. The silence in the diner thickened. Was this another dead end? Or was there a flicker of something in the old man's eyes? Fear? Guilt? Brody couldn't tell. But he knew one thing. Northwood still had secrets, and he was determined to unearth them, no matter how deep they were buried. He spent the next few days in Northwood, talking to people, or trying to. He visited the high school, spoke to the coach who had been there 10 years ago. The coach was older now, more weathered, but his story hadn't changed. He remembered the game, remembered the Oakhaven boys, said they were good kids, good players. Said he didn't see anything unusual after the game. They left, and that was it. Brody pressed him. "Any fights? Any arguments? Any local kids who might have had a problem with them?" The coach was adamant. "No, nothing like that." But Brody sensed a tension, a holding back. It was in the way the coach wouldn't quite meet his eyes, in the way his answers were a little too quick, a little too rehearsed. He visited the gas station where the boys might have stopped, the convenience store. He showed their pictures. Some remembered them, vaguely. Black kids, athletes, stood out in a town like Northwood, which was almost entirely white. But no one remembered anything specific, anything helpful. It was like hitting a wall of fog. Everyone was sorry. Everyone said it was a tragedy, but no one knew anything. Or so they claimed. Brody started to feel a creeping sense of frustration, the same frustration the original investigators must have felt. But he also felt a growing conviction. Someone in this town knew something. The boys had been alive when they left the Northwood High gym. Hours later, they were dead, or dying, in a cave miles away. What happened in those intervening hours? What route did they take? And who, or what, did they encounter? The break, when it came, was small, almost accidental. Brody was having dinner in the diner again, a quiet, solitary meal, when a woman who worked there, a waitress in her late 40s, paused by his table a little longer than necessary while refilling his water. She looked nervous, glancing around. "Sheriff," she said, her voice barely a whisper. There was talk back then." Brody looked up, his senses instantly alert. "What kind of talk?" The waitress licked her lips. "About some of the local boys, the rougher crowd. They didn't like outsiders. Especially not, well, you know," she didn't have to say it. "Especially not black outsiders who came to their town and played against their team. They were bragging," she continued, her voice even lower. "After those boys went missing. Bragging about teaching some city kids a lesson. No one took it seriously. Just drunk talk, you know." Brody leaned forward. "Names," he said. "Do you remember any names?" She hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. It was a long time ago, and they were just stupid kids, probably nothing. But she said a name, just one, Billy Ray Johnson. Said he was the loudest, the worst of them. Said he had a temper, and a daddy who was even meaner, who used to be a big deal in the town, unofficially. Billy Ray. Brody filed the name away. "It wasn't much," Drunk talk from 10 years ago. But it was something. It was a thread. And in a cold case like this, a single thread could sometimes unravel everything. He thanked the waitress, told her she'd done the right thing, assured her he'd be discreet. As he left the diner that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Billy Ray Johnson. It was time to find out what Billy Ray knew, or what he had done. Finding Billy Ray Johnson wasn't hard. He still lived in Northwood, in a rundown trailer on the outskirts of town, not far from his father's equally dilapidated property. He was older now, in his late 20s, but from what Brody could gather, he hadn't changed much. Still a troublemaker, still quick to anger, still drinking too much. Brody approached him cautiously. He didn't go in with accusations. He just wanted to talk. About that night, 10 years ago. Billy Ray was surly, uncooperative. He denied everything. Said he didn't remember that night, didn't know any Oakhaven boys, didn't know anything about any cave. He was a bad liar. Brody could see it in his shifty eyes, in the way his hands trembled slightly. He was scared. Brody pressed him, gently at first, then with more force. He told him about the bodies, about the murder investigation. He told him that withholding information was a crime. Billy Ray started to sweat. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to appear. His father, maybe? "I didn't do nothing," Billy Ray insisted, his voice cracking. "I wasn't even there." "Where?" Brody asked. "Where weren't you?" Billy Ray looked trapped. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He shook his head. "I ain't saying nothing more without my lawyer." Brody knew he couldn't push him further, not without more evidence. But he had seen enough. Billy Ray Johnson knew something. He was involved, somehow. The fear in his eyes was too real. As Brody left, he saw a curtain twitch in the window of the nearby trailer, the one belonging to Billy Ray's father, Earl Johnson. Earl was watching. And Earl, Brody knew from local gossip, was a man to be reckoned with. A man with a dark reputation. A man who protected his own no matter what. The thread was leading somewhere. Somewhere dangerous. The state investigators, armed with the name Billy Ray Johnson and the information about his father, Earl, started digging. They pulled old police records, interviewed other people who knew the Johnsons. A picture began to emerge of a family steeped in petty crime, violence, and a fierce, almost tribal loyalty. Earl Johnson, it turned out, had a history of run-ins with the law, though nothing major had ever stuck. He was known for his racist views, his hatred of anyone not from Northwood. Billy Ray was his father's son, easily influenced, eager to please, and prone to violence when fueled by alcohol or his father's rhetoric. The theory began to form: what if the Oakhaven boys, after leaving the game, had a confrontation with Billy Ray and his friends? Maybe a minor incident, a fender bender, or just words exchanged. Something that escalated, fueled by alcohol and prejudice. Something that got out of hand, terribly out of hand. But how did it lead to a cave miles away and 4 murders? That was still a huge leap. They needed more than just a theory. They needed evidence. They started looking at Billy Ray's known associates from 10 years ago. Who were his friends? Who was part of that rougher crowd the waitress had mentioned? One name kept coming up: Dale Higgins. Dale had also been a known troublemaker, Billy Ray's right-hand man. But Dale Higgins, they discovered, wasn't in Northwood anymore. He left town a few years after the boys disappeared, moved out of state. No one seemed to know exactly where. Finding Dale Higgins became the new priority. Maybe, away from Northwood, away from the influence of the Johnsons, Dale might be willing to talk. Maybe Dale held the key to unlocking the truth of what happened that night. The search for Dale Higgins took weeks. He'd moved around a lot, never staying in one place for long. It was as if he was running from something. Finally, they tracked him down to a small town in a neighboring state, working a dead-end job, living a quiet, almost reclusive life. 2 state investigators went to see him. They found him in a greasy diner, much like the one in Northwood, hunched over a plate of cold fries. He looked older than his years, haunted. When the investigators identified themselves, Dale didn't seem surprised. It was as if he'd been expecting them. He didn't say much at first, just listened as they laid out what they knew, what they suspected. They told him about the bodies in the cave, about the murder investigation. They told him they knew he was friends with Billy Ray Johnson. They asked him what happened that night. Dale stared at his fries, pushing them around his plate with a fork. The silence stretched. Then he looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Resignation? Relief? "It was an accident," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." The investigators exchanged a look. This was it. The dam was breaking. "Tell us, Dale," one of them said, his voice gentle. "Tell us what happened." And Dale Higgins began to talk. His story, when it finally spilled out, was a horrifying account of a night gone terribly wrong. A story of prejudice, stupidity, and escalating violence that ended in unimaginable tragedy. Dale confirmed that he, Billy Ray, and a couple of other local boys, fueled by cheap beer and resentment after their team lost, had decided to mess with the Oak Haven players. They followed Marcus's old sedan as it left Northwood, heading down the old Highway 7. Their plan, Dale said, was just to scare them. Run them off the road, maybe rough them up a bit, teach them a lesson about coming to their town. They managed to force Marcus's car to a stop in a remote stretch of road. That part matched where the car was found, out of gas. Dale said they siphoned the gas, just to be mean, to leave them stranded. The Oak Haven boys, outnumbered and in a strange place, were scared but tried to stand their ground. Words were exchanged, shoves. Then Billy Ray, always the hothead, escalated things. He pulled out a tire iron from their truck. He hit one of the boys, Marcus, hard. Marcus went down. That's when things spiraled completely out of control. Panic set in. The other Oak Haven boys tried to fight back, to defend their friend. But they were no match for Billy Ray, now enraged. And his friends, armed with whatever they could find, rocks, branches. Dale claimed he tried to stop it, said it was going too far, but Billy Ray was like a man possessed. And then, Earl Johnson showed up. Billy Ray had called him, panicked, when Marcus first went down. Earl arrived, took one look at the scene, at the injured boy, and his cold, calculating mind took over. He knew this couldn't be left unfinished. Witnesses couldn't be allowed to survive. According to Dale, it was Earl who directed them to the cave, an old hunting spot he knew, remote, hidden. He said it was Earl who had the gun. He said Earl made them march the remaining 3 boys, along with the now barely conscious Marcus, to that cave. What happened inside the cave, Dale was less clear about, his voice choked with emotion, his eyes wide with remembered horror. He said there was shouting, begging, then the sound of the gun, and the thuds. He said Earl made them all help block the entrance, threatening them, telling them they were all in it together now. They were never to speak of it, ever. Dale's confession was a bombshell. It painted a chilling picture of calculated cruelty, orchestrated by Earl Johnson, carried out by his son and his cronies. The investigators pressed Dale for the names of the other boys involved. He gave them 2 more names. With Dale's testimony, they now had enough to move on Earl and Billy Ray Johnson, and the others. Arrest warrants were issued. The news hit Oak Haven, and the families like a second shockwave. This time, it was a shockwave of rage, but also, finally, a sense of impending justice. Sarah Jenkins felt a cold fury. These men, these boys, had stolen her son's life. stolen the lives of 3 other promising young men over nothing: prejudice, ignorance, cruelty. She wanted to see their faces, to look them in the eye. David Henderson's father, when he heard the news, simply nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. It wouldn't bring David back, but it was something. It was an answer. It was accountability. The arrests were made swiftly. Earl Johnson, Billy Ray, and the 2 others Dale had named were taken into custody. Earl remained defiant, cold, denying everything. Billy Ray, separated from his father, crumbled quickly, his bravado gone. The other 2, faced with Dale's testimony and the threat of long prison sentences, began to corroborate Dale's story, though each tried to minimize their own role, pointing fingers at Earl and Billy Ray. The town of Northwood was in shock. Many couldn't believe it. Others, perhaps, had always suspected something dark lay beneath the surface of their quiet community, but had chosen to look away. Now, they couldn't. The secret was out. The evil that had festered there for a decade was exposed. The trial was long and harrowing. Dale Higgins, given a deal for his testimony, recounted the events of that terrible night in agonizing detail. The courtroom was silent, except for the occasional sob from the families section. Sarah Jenkins sat through every day, her eyes fixed on the accused, her expression a mixture of grief and steely resolve. She had to bear witness. For Marcus, for all of them. The defense attorneys tried to discredit Dale, tried to paint the Oak Haven boys as aggressors, tried to argue it was self-defense gone wrong. But the evidence from the cave, Dr. Thorne's meticulous forensic report detailing the brutal injuries, the gunshot wound, it all painted a very different picture. The varsity jackets, the muddy sneakers found outside the cave, now seemed like ghostly relics of that desperate final journey. The blocked entrance of the cave became a potent symbol of the defendants' callousness, their attempt to bury their crime forever. Billy Ray Johnson eventually broke down on the stand, confessing his role, but trying to shift most of the blame to his father. Earl Johnson remained impassive, his face a mask of cold indifference. He never testified. He never showed a flicker of remorse. In the end, the jury found them all guilty. Earl Johnson, as the architect of the crime, received multiple life sentences without parole. Billy Ray and the others received sentences ranging from 25 years to life, depending on their level of involvement. Dale Higgins, for his cooperation, received a lesser sentence, but he would still spend years behind bars, haunted by what he had done and what he had failed to prevent. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served, but for the families, the pain would never truly go away. There was a measure of peace in knowing the truth, in seeing those responsible held accountable. But it wouldn't bring their sons back. It wouldn't fill the void left by their absence. Sarah Jenkins, standing outside the courthouse after the verdicts, spoke to the assembled media, her voice trembling but strong. She said, "They were good boys. They had dreams. They were loved, and they were stolen from us. This verdict doesn't bring them back, but it honors their memory. And it sends a message that hate and violence will not win." She held up a picture of Marcus, David, Jamal, and Kevin, smiling, arms around each other, in their basketball uniforms. "Remember them like this," she said, "not as victims, but as the bright, shining souls they were." The town of Oak Haven mourned, but there was also a sense of closure. The cloud that had hung over them for a decade had finally lifted, though the sky would never be quite as bright again. The cave on the old highway was eventually sealed, permanently this time, by the state. Not as a tomb, but as a memorial. A quiet, somber place where 4 young lives ended, but where their story and the fight for justice would not be forgotten. The varsity jackets and sneakers once symbols of youthful promise, then of tragic discovery, were returned to the families, along with the other personal items found in the cave. Tangible links to their lost sons. Each item a heartbreaking reminder of what was and what could have been. The mountain kept its silence now, its deepest secret finally told. But the echoes of that night, the echoes of those lost lives, would resonate for a long, long time. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.